Não, not me. Have you, Daniel?
No. Wait.
Jocko, let's make sure that we send the report. Can you take a note on that? Yeah, there's a very interesting plan that was developed for a global, sustainable, and just cannabis industry by a think tank in Berlin that built that plan along consistently with the 10-year plan of the United Nations. It's a very, very interesting document.
Oh, that would be excellent to have access on that. Let's check. I think we were having problems with YouTube. They were dropping the connection. I don't know if that's solved.
Are we in?
Oi, Alex. Oi, Marcelo. Estamos no YouTube.
We're live.
Let's make sure that we send the report. Take a note on.
Alex,
So are we good to go?
yes.
We are? Wow. That's exciting. So, first of all, welcome. This is our first cannabis thinking talks. That's how we call it. And we've done a couple of sessions in the past, recorded. This is our first live session. So we do apologize. We had some technical problems starting the session, starting a bit late, but nevertheless, it's a huge pleasure to be here tonight. And we have for our first live, a very, very, very special guest that I'll have the opportunity to introduce in just a second. My name is Alex Lucena. I'm the head of innovation for the Green Hub, the first accelerator in Brazil, fully dedicated to the cannabis industry. I'd like to introduce here my colleagues that will be with me tonight. I'm talking to you from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. My three other colleagues are in São Paulo. Marcelo Greco, my friend, my partner in the Green Hub. Paula Carvalho, journalist here representing the Humanities 360 Institute. Well known in Brazil and doing great things all over the Americas. You'll certainly hear a lot about that in the future. And Daniel, of course, Jordão, which is a partner. He's the founder of Portal Sechat. Sechat is most likely nowadays the main reference in terms of news, in terms of information, and the Brazilian cannabis industry. So thank you guys a lot for making time and to be with us. So before I proceed and introduce our special guest, I would just like to make this one announcement. That is, this session is being recorded. We decided to do it fully in English, but in a couple of days, 3 days from now, we'll be making this material available with subtitles in Portuguese and Spanish, okay? So that we can reach out to, with no mistake, to the entire Latin America community, okay? And Steve, just give me 1 second. I'll say that in Portuguese just to make sure that people got this information, okay? Real quickly. Então, assim, para nossa audiência no Brasil e na América Latina, nós estamos gravando essa sessão e no máximo em 2, 3 dias nós iremos disponibilizar o material completo com legendas em português e espanhol, okay? So, with no further ado, it's a great honor, truly a pleasure, to introduce, the father, so-called father of the cannabis, legal cannabis, the cannabis industry. There's so many nicknames, Steve, that I don't know. What I can say is that you're a lot of people here in our country like hearing from you. You're an activist, you're an educator, you're an entrepreneur, you're an investor, you're an author. So, we have a lot to learn from you. So, welcome to Brazil. Welcome to the Cannabis Thinking Talks. And pass the ball to you, as we say it over here in Portuguese, in terms of soccer. I'm passing the ball to you. for your initial remarks to the Brazilian tribe as you described in your recent post. Okay, thanks for being here.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, Alex, and I had the pleasure last year in 2019 of spending 200 days on the road, and I almost made it to Brazil, but not quite. So I very much look forward to coming to Brazil as soon as it's possible for us to do that. I think that the situation of Brazil now is one that I'm just really beginning to learn about and figure out. But I know that there's a rich history of cannabis in Brazil. I know that there's millions and millions of people who have a special attachment to the cannabis plant throughout the country. I know that there are thousands and thousands of families who have been one of the leading forces in moving reform forward and keeping this conversation happening. So I'm really excited to hear about these very beginning steps towards reform in Brazil. And moving forward, my mission in life is really going to be doing what I'm doing now, which is speaking to the global cannabis community. There are now millions of us, tens of millions of us, hundreds of millions of people around the world who have been touched by the cannabis plant. We are in all different countries, we speak different languages, but we have a common appreciation of the plant and a common work to bring that reform forward. So that's what I'm planning on doing is talking to all of the different emerging cannabis economies around the world. And Brazil, of course, is now joining what's becoming an ever growing wave of cannabis reform all around the world. It really started in California during the AIDS crisis, when we were able to pass the first medical cannabis laws and start being able to publicly distribute cannabis. And our goal then was to demonstrate to the world that that could be done in a way that brought benefits to communities rather than harms. And I think we've been very successful in doing that. And of course, we saw that reform first spread across the United States, and then to Canada, and now to the rest of the world. So I am looking forward to keeping that pace up, to increasing that pace, to bringing this movement together all around the world, including Brazil.
So this count on us, okay, to echo all you just said. We're big advocates, and this is a 200,000 million population, so it's a gigantic country, and we're just getting started. So this is how it's going to work, Steve. We have about give or take an hour, with you, give or take. I will circle the questions. We'll be covering different topics, and I'll just be the facilitator. So, circling around the questions. After you're done, a couple of minutes for comments, and we'll take it from there, okay?
Sounds like fun.
Okay. So let me start with my buddy over here in the left-hand side, upper hand side. Marcelo has been in the industry in the Brazilian industry since day one. These guys with his cousin Marcel founded um, the Green Hub, and so Marcelo, please, it's a pleasure. Kick it off.
Steve, really big pleasure to talk to you and to address these questions to you. So let me go with my first question. So it's clear that cannabis has become essential worldwide. The U.S. and Canada's government tried to keep dispensaries closed that only lasted a few hours. Um, the U.S. and Canada government tried to keep dispensaries closed only a few hours. Countries are right now in the verge of some type of recession. Brazilian agribusiness occupies a well-deserved place in the country's economic development. We have conquered new markets, invested in technology, and little by little, we are managing to keep young people in the field. If you could send the Brazilian government a message right now, what advice would you give them in terms of accelerating cannabis cultivation regulations?
Well, I'd say that now is the time to move, and it's the time to move quickly. The really good news about cannabis is that there's a lot of different types of cannabis, and depending on the historical and cultural and legal conditions in any country, there's almost some sector of the industry which can get started. So, I understand in Brazil now that most of the cannabis, aside from the associations, is restricted to import. And I think that that's just a crazy thing for any government to do to their country because my belief is that one day, maybe not in my lifetime, but certainly in your lifetime, Marcelo, cannabis by dollar volume is going to be the most valuable product in the world. The basic reason for that is that anything that you make from a tree or from petroleum or from cotton can be made less expensively and more sustainably from cannabis. So there's a vast realm of opportunity to develop a cannabis industry without even dealing with the political issues of psychoactive cannabis. So I'd say that's a sector that the government of Brazil should be looking at very quickly. I'd also say that the important thing to do now is also recognize that there is an existing cannabis industry in Brazil, that there are many, many people who make cannabis their livelihood, who have been involved in the gray market, unregulated underground trade. And I think that it's important when any country starts thinking about regulating cannabis to think about bringing that underground market above ground and making sure that the people who participate in that market are able to reintegrate and re-engage with a legal market, which is better for the country and better for those people.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Steve.
So yeah, of course. Let us. Anybody wants to kick in a comment or just should I just move around to Paula? Daniel.
This one question. We have heard a lot about the legal in California, for instance, the legal market and the legal market. Since they open for medical or adult use, but the illegal market still is going on. How do you see? What could you say about that?
So just to encapsulate this, in 2018 there was a very big change in California. We went from a nonprofit medical cannabis market to a for-profit adult use market. And when that change happened, we went from a patchwork of quite loose local regulations to a statewide system of regulation. And that system, unfortunately, did two things that were very bad things to do, especially at the same time. One, it made the licensing requirements so high, so difficult, so expensive for anybody to actually get a license that the majority of the existing cannabis growers in California were unable to enter the legal market. They simply did not have enough money to be able to go through the licensing process. At the same time, there was a tax policy which allowed every entity and jurisdiction in the state, local entities, county entities, the state entities, to tax cannabis. And there was a kind of crazy overtaxation of cannabis. So the average tax on cannabis went from about 10% in the medical market to around 50% today in the adult use market. So what happened is you had all of the consumers who were coming to the medical cannabis dispensaries. When we switched over to this new regulated system, they went into the shop and they saw these really crazy high prices, and they went like running out of the shop with sticker shock. And they ran right into the hands of all of the underground growers who were unable to get legal licenses. And so those two demographics of people are now servicing each other very effectively in the unregulated market. So today, when I'm speaking to investors or the media, and they ask me who my major competitor is, I tell them it's the illegal market. That's really the only competitor that I worry about.
Today you still face this problem. They still
Oh yes, we still face this problem today, and I think that there's another important regulatory lesson in here. There's a lot of governments who view the legalization of cannabis as a opportunity to radically increase their tax revenue.
Okay.
And to make a lot of licensing fees. And I would urge them to resist the temptation to do that. There's a few reasons for that. One, almost everywhere around the world, there's a well-established, unregulated cannabis distribution system. And because it's unregulated, because you don't have costs of compliance, you don't have inspections, you don't have specialized equipment, it is much less expensive to operate in the unregulated realm than it is in the regulated realm.
Right.
So already, when you're trying to legalize cannabis, there's a bit of a competitive edge that the underground market has. But when you put higher taxes and higher regulatory burdens on there, then you really just make it impossible. Better to keep the taxes either non-existent or very reasonable. I think that one approach that countries should consider is a 2-year tax holiday. Have a cannabis tax, but do not impose that tax until year 3 of the legal licensed industry, to give the legal licensed industry some equal footing to compete with the unregulated market, where, of course, no taxes are being collected.
A little bit more on this subject. I'm sorry. So could Colorado be a positive example on that matter? Did Colorado get that done well?
Colorado didn't have as big a challenge in doing that as California did, but yes, Colorado did a much better job of it than California. Their regulatory burden was less, and their tax burden was less. But also, Colorado really did not have an extensive cannabis production economy prior to legalized cannabis. They generally imported most of their cannabis from Mexico or from California. So it was less of a challenge to erode the underground market because that market was much weaker in Colorado in the first place.
Excellent answer.
Just to wrap up this question and that we can move on, my comment would be availability. You mentioned a lot about taxes and prices and competition with the underground, but availability, do you think that is an issue as well in terms of distribution, making it available quickly on the legal basis for more dispensaries, I don't know, for example, or through the web? Availability, distribution.
The very best way to tame the underground market is to use market forces. And that means to create a viable legal industry that's capable of competing with the underground market, both in scale and on price and on quality. And so scale is important. You are not going to be able to quell the underground market if you don't issue thousands. In a country like Brazil, there has to be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of licenses that need to be issued. And how those licenses are issued is very important. And there are some states in the United States that have required companies to be vertically integrated in order to get cannabis licenses. There are other states like Oregon which have essentially prohibited any form of verticality in the supply chain. And so, and you're thinking about gearing up and entry quickly. I'm really a fan of promoting an industry where you may allow some degree of vertical integration, but the regulatory incentives are set up to license a very large number of people, each of whom can occupy a specific niche along the supply chain, rather than a few number of licensees who operate across the entire supply chain.
Super, super. Paula, let me turn it to you now, and please go ahead.
Hi, Steve. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I thank you also the Great Green Hub guys for the invitation. And I'm here representing Humanitas 360 Institute, which is an institute founded by Patricia Vilela Marino and her family. and it proposes a broad view about the question of violence and mass incarceration. And we work now mainly with women in prison. And here in Brazil, more than 50% of women are in jail because of drug-related crimes. And they are on the street selling, transporting. They are the weakest point in the chain of the drug dealing. And they are definitely not the most important or the most dangerous people on this chain of drugs. And while this process of changing the mindset about cannabis are happening, we start to wonder what those people in jail thinks when they hear that there is legal businesses out there selling cannabis and they are arrested because of this. So you can imagine how happy we were to hear about the Last Prisoner project that you founded. And I'm curious about it, and I wish you could explain to us a little bit how it works and the results achieved so far.
Well, Paula, thank you very much for the question and for the good work that you're doing in prisons with 360 Humanitas. The Last Prisoner Project has one very simple-minded, single-minded mission, and that is to make sure that as we build this worldwide global legal cannabis industry, as people build wealth, sometimes very large amounts of wealth, intergenerational amounts of wealth, that the people who are still in prison for doing exactly the same thing are released, are brought home, and are given the resources that they need to rebuild their lives. So we do this work in a number of different ways. We look to our funding primarily to the legal cannabis industry, which has very generously supported our work. We've been in existence for a year. Prior to the COVID crisis, we were concentrating on two main areas. One was clemency. In states in which cannabis has been made legal in the United States, the governors have an ability to release cannabis prisoners. And so we've been working to get them to do that. And thus far, we haven't persuaded very many of them to do that, but it's a long process. And in the middle of this work, the COVID crisis hit, and it's really as I imagine it is in Brazil. COVID is ubiquitous in U.S. prisons, and so our 40,000 constituents who have been convicted of nonviolent cannabis crimes could face a death sentence by being there. So we've been working on a legal procedure called compassionate release, which we've been more successful at. So we've been able to help several prisoners be released on that basis, and we're continuing to push forward other cases. So, and then the other part is helping people rebuild their lives. And of course, cannabis prisoners are released every day. And so we have an ability immediately to assist them. And so we have a program that first introduces those released cannabis prisoners to mentors, people who are working within the cannabis industry, who can mentor them and teach them and be their personal advocates, introduce them to their network of associates. We have developed a training curriculum so that released cannabis prisoners can learn the basic skills that are needed to participate in the legal cannabis economy. And then we have a partnership with one of the leading cannabis human resources placement firms to place those graduates of the training course. So all of that's underway. Our first class is just waiting the lifting of the COVID restrictions.
I have a question on that. Yes, countries like Brazil they're just starting to regulate cannabis. How could we start already thinking about a project like yours, like the Last Prisoner project, right in the beginning? So should we start? What was the secret to start a regulation already thinking about that?
Well, that's a great question because I'm sorry, Alex.
No, we're just going to say on top of that question would be how can we help here in Brazil to echo, for example, an institute such as Humanitas 360. How can we, um, bring more support to your project in our country? On top of Marcelo's question.
Hmm. So I think that what we really want to look towards is as we implement reforms, we want to make sure that cannabis prisoners are included and are thought about. That has not happened in most countries to date. So if you look at all of the reform laws in the United States or in Canada, none of them specify that cannabis prisoners should be released after cannabis is made legal. You would think that that would just happen, but it doesn't. And so if you don't take specific steps to make sure you have language in your laws that call for that to happen, those prisoners, and I'm sure there's many cannabis prisoners in Brazil, will just remain in prison. So that's the long-term goal. In the short term, what we found is that the most important thing to do is to give face to our constituents and to tell their stories. Most people who are not familiar already with what's going on are shocked when I tell them stories about people like Michael Thompson, who is 69 years old, who is imprisoned in the state of Michigan, serving a 40 to 60-year sentence for selling 3 pounds. That's 1.5 kilos of cannabis to an undercover detective in the 1990s. So, just to give you a metric, right now, the police officers who have been charged in the death of George Floyd are facing maximum sentences of 40 years. And Michael Thompson is serving up to 60 years for the sale of 3 pounds of cannabis.
I have some comments on that. Uh, here in Brazil, we don't have much data and information about this crime, cannabis-related crimes. We do have about drug crimes, but not on cannabis specifically. And in the United States, I see that you have a lot of information about this kind of crime. How did you started to produce this exactly information?
Well, it's been challenging because what we find in many places, Brazil, the United States, the individual states here, is that law enforcement authorities tend to like to lump cannabis crimes in with all other drug crimes. And there's a reason for that. At least in the United States, out of all of the arrests that were made during the war on drugs, over 80% of those arrests were for cannabis offenses, for non-violent cannabis offenses. And so they don't really want to publicize that because it's such an outrageous fact. But the families of people who have been imprisoned on cannabis charges know who those people are, and they know who their stories are. And so what I would say is that you call out.
Was the manifesto, right? Uh, Cannabis, which was written, I believe, in 2015. Is that correct, or ish?
Published in 2015, written in 2014.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, about 5 years now, and it already had the word, the paradigm of wellness, and wellness is all we talk about. It's all that really matters is health, wellness. Making us live longer with a better quality of life. The way this world is kind of crazy nowadays. We need wellness. We need cannabis more than ever. I mean, this is, I believe, the opinion here. 100% of the group that's in talking here. And what I wanted you to say is, I mean, what can you tell us about your new book that you mentioned to me when we first spoke? That you know, what's the main message? I mean, that's coming up. I mean, just I don't give it a spoiler, but what can you say about your upcoming book? Let's hope we have it in Brazil shortly.
So what I'm working on now is a book-length version of my presentation that I did at South by Southwest last year, entitled "The Cannabis Renaissance." And the Cannabis Renaissance sort of starts where the Cannabis Manifesto left off. In the Cannabis Manifesto, I was really talking about the harms that prohibition had created, and some of the new science on cannabis, and the way forward in terms of how we should think about cannabis to get legalization in place. With the Cannabis Renaissance, I asked the question, okay, now that we've been able to make some reforms, what have we learned and where are we headed? And one of the points that I make is that today, unlike 10 years ago, we now have a track record. We don't have to work to speculate about what happens when cannabis is legalized. We can just look at the publicly available statistics and records of several American states that have gone through the experience. And when we do that, what do we find? We find that there's this very wide range of benefits, that pharmaceutical consumption goes down, alcohol consumption goes down, violent crime goes down, domestic abuse goes down, taxation goes up, employment goes up, and it's very consistent. You can see it time after time. So that's part of the point that I'm making, and then I'm also pointing towards the future. And I'm thinking about a time when we really fully develop the potential of hemp. And just imagine, if you would, a truck like the Amazon trucks that are delivering packages all the time. But this truck, the body of the truck is made out of hemp plastic. And all of the boxes in that truck and all of the plastic that's wrapping those boxes are made out of sustainable, ecologically grown hemp. And half of the products in those boxes are made out of hemp. And the fuel that the truck runs on is a hemp biofuel, or maybe it's electricity from a hemp-powered electrical plant. And when the driver puts on her shoes or her uniform, that's made out of hemp. When she stops at the cafe to have lunch, her salad dressing is made out of hemp. The bread that she eats is made out of hemp powder, and the waiter's uniform is made out of a hemp textile. This is the world that we're heading to, and it will be a much, much healthier world because we will be able to provide for all of our needs without cutting down the last tree on the planet, without turning Earth into a cinder.
Perfect. Yeah. Same page. Totally, totally agree. Laughing out loud here. Let's circle around. Ladies first. Paula, if you could start, your final remarks so that we can thank Steve and wrap it up. Please go ahead.
Well, it was